Time for a quick quiz. Look at these two pictures. On the left, we have a picture of a Klan march in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. On the right, a colorful 1936 map of Seattle, Washington. Here's the quiz. Which one of these is about race? Okay, so it's a trick quiz. They're both about race. It's a video series about Christianity and race, so really, what were the odds? Most of us would immediately recognize the Klan as being about race. But the map, well, that might be less clear. In this episode, we're going to explore various ways some people, during the middle third of the 20th century, implicitly or explicitly claimed that the United States was really for and about white people. In ways both subtle and overt, we live with these claims still, so it's worth knowing where they come from and why they continue to matter. A quick warning, this episode might seem a little less focused on religion than you might expect from a series about, well, Christianity and race. But Christians still continue to grapple with issues related to things like who you live next to, who really counts as a Christian, and who you're most likely to go to church with. We struggle with them both as citizens of this country and believers, so they're important issues to explore. It's probably not surprising that the picture of the Klan marching in Washington, D.C. coincides with what some historians call the nadir, or worst point of race relations in the United States. Well, historians, and I'm sure this will shock you, don't completely agree on the years of the low point. They usually place it between 1890 and sometime before World War II. But the point is that the years in which the Klan could openly march in Washington, D.C. clearly marked a low point in the history of race relations. The Klan march represented a larger worry on the part of some white Americans. For these folks, the United States had been created as a white Protestant nation. Not only the continuing presence of African Americans, but increasing numbers of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, many of whom were Catholic or Jewish, as well as immigrants from Asia, undermined their white Protestant nation. In the minds of some white Protestants, it was their duty to save white Protestant America. The reemergence of the Klan in the 1920s was the most obvious example of white Protestants trying to save the nation. Today, many people think of the Klan as a fringe group, a small group of disaffected people living on the margins of society. But the Klan of the early 1920s was not small and it was not fringe. At its height, it boasted 4 million members. You could find Claverins, or local Klan groups, in places like New Jersey and Wisconsin. Indiana had the largest state Klan organization, and it was so politically influential that the 1924 state legislature was called the Klan legislature. What the Klan said and did resonated with millions of Americans from coast to coast, from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. As historian Kelly Baker has shown, according to Klan leaders, whiteness and Protestantism fit together. The Klan logic went like this. The Nordic nations in England had been most receptive to Protestantism. Their people were also white. So according to the Klan, the unity between Protestantism and Americanism is no accident. The two spring from the same racial qualities, and each is a part of our group mind. Together they worked to build America, and together they will work to preserve it. It is worth noting a few things about the story the Klan told about America. First, the story claimed that America's success was due to white Protestants, that a lot of America's economic success had come through the unpaid labor of black people and the low-paid labor of a lot of non-Protestant immigrants didn't come up in the Klan's telling of history. Second, there was an assumption that winning showed God's favor. In the Klan telling, you knew that God wanted America to be white and Protestant because white Protestants had succeeded in gaining the land and controlling it. It was a we know who's right by who has might reading of history. That the might makes right reading of history seems pretty definitively undermined by, The martyrdoms of Paul or Peter, or the ability of the mighty Roman Empire to kill the innocent Son of God didn't really seem to bother the Klan's logic. The third thing to note about the Klan's philosophy was the association of whiteness with Protestantism. Although in the 1920s, like today, most African American Christians were Protestant, in the Klan's account, the real Protestants were white Protestants. Black people could never be Protestant enough or Christian enough really to belong in the United States, because only white people really counted as Protestants or Christians. I want to pause here for a second. It's easy to dismiss this way of thinking because most of us have been taught, appropriately, to assume that the Klan is wrong. But I sometimes wonder if the Klan's way of thinking isn't more similar to how some of us, particularly white some of us, think than we'd like to admit. Take the history of Christianity and race. When I first started learning about this topic from historians, I grew frustrated because it felt like the whole story was about how bad Christians were. Where were the good Christians, the one who showed forth the power of the gospel, I wondered. Maybe you've been watching this video series and asking the same question. But here's what's interesting. I was hearing quite a bit about Christians operating in the power of the gospel. I heard about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. I heard about Richard Allen. When I asked when I was going to hear about Christians operating in the power of the gospel, what I really meant was, when am I going to hear about white people doing good things? Somehow, it didn't really count as much if it were black Christians doing good things. Now, of course, there were white people who acted in the power of the gospel. But what interests me is the reaction, the sense that unless white peoples are heroes of a given story, we aren't really talking about Christianity. That who counts the most as Christians are white Christians. Because then it seems I'm not really interested in the power of the gospel, but in making sure that the people I identify with, meaning here white people, not unfortunately the worldwide body of Christ, that those people look good. In any case, that's been a lesson for me and a good, if painful, reality check. It forces me to ask who I really most identify with. God's people regardless of race, or people considered to be my race. It forces me to ask whether I'm most invested in the power of the gospel or in affirming the goodness of my own racial group. Back to our story. Although most Americans did not join the Klan and the revived Klan of the early 1920s fell apart, the country, in myriad ways, echoed the Klan's logic about who could really be American, who really mattered. Lynchings, for example, continued, and the federal government did little. Southern states continued to deny most African Americans the right to vote, and the federal government allowed them to get away with it. During the New Deal, African Americans often faced greater hurdles in getting access to relief than white people, particularly if local governments administered the relief programs. White people's lives took precedence over those of black people. That leads us back to the map of Seattle, and a key way in which both government policy and business practices served white people better than black people. That way was housing. Let's look at the map of Seattle. I'm picking on Seattle because it's where much of my family has lived for years, and because today people, depending on their politics, think of it either as a bastion of progressive values or as a hellscape of liberalism made livable only by the ubiquitous presence of coffee shops. In either case, the point is we're talking about a northern city. In the early decades of the 20th century, millions of African Americans moved out of the South and to northern cities. Seattle was not their most likely destination. Places like Chicago and New York were much more common. But what played out in Seattle played out around the country. As black people moved from the segregated South, they found themselves in a segregated North. And one of the reasons for that continued segregation had to do with government housing policies. During the Depression, the federal government wanted to help some people, at least, avoid foreclosure and to make it easier for some people to buy homes. So it created two agencies, the Homeowners Loan Corporation and, for our story, the more important Federal Housing Authority, to do that. Their strategy was for the government to insure mortgage loans. That put the government in the business of risk assessment. The Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps of major American cities that indicated how risky it was to give loans in different neighborhoods. That's where the colors on the map come in. Green and blue areas were the best and still desirable. Yellow and red areas were definitely declining or hazardous. Various factors went into determining the colors. Race was one. Racially homogeneous white areas were deemed least risky. For example, assessor notes on the A2 area of Seattle indicate that the property in the area is protected with building and racial restrictions. Note that in this context, that the property was protected from non-white homeowners is seen as a good thing. B12, a blue area, was older, but the notes reported that, notwithstanding the age of the district, the locality has no racial problem, meaning racial people. B5 was a newly settled district, and the property has buildings and racial restrictions. What made an area less risky was the absence of Black people and rules to prevent them from moving in. The Homeowners Loan Corporation did make loans in C and D areas. The policies of the Federal Housing Authority, recording in its underwriting manuals in the 1930s and 1940s, were not so permissive. For the FHA, what made an area insurable was white racial homogeneity. Until 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled that state action could not be used to enforce racially restrictive covenants, the FHA actually preferred to insure loans in places with racial covenants. Even after 1948, it rated areas where anyone but white people lived as risky. And that meant that banks and real estate agents and people in insurable neighborhoods had every incentive to keep white neighborhoods white. As a result, the federal government, banks, and real estate agents all engaged in a practice called redlining. Red lines on maps marked off white and non-white areas. Banks would not give loans to Black people, even if they had perfect credit to buy a house outside the red line. And quite often, they wouldn't get loans to buy within the red line either. Even if they did, they were buying in an area that received less infusion of money from the federal government, meaning that their investments did not appreciate as quickly, if they appreciated at all. Now that may all sound like long ago history, but it isn't. Seattle did not pass a Fair Housing Act until 1968, the same year the nation did. 1968 is living memory for a lot of people in the United States, but more importantly, it's living equity. When I talk about race with Christians, particularly white Christians, I often hear that racism is no longer really a problem, or it's no more of a problem than what some folks call reverse racism, or prejudice against white people. For these folks, racism involves overt acts of racial prejudice, like not being willing to sit next to a Black person at a lunch counter, or believing that some races are inherently better than others. They think that laws fix the first problem and that Christian faith should fix the other. They believe that everyone practicing virtues like responsibility, thrift, and hard work has an equal chance of success in this country. And that really egregious examples aside, there aren't major racial injustices in this country left to fix. Here's why I think that theory doesn't quite work. It has to do with this map, my family, housing, and equity. In 1955, my paternal grandparents moved from South Dakota to Seattle. They bought a house with an attached lot in this area, a B area. Now, to be clear, my family wasn't rolling in money. My grandfather couch surfed for many years during the Great Depression after his family lost the farm. When he moved to Seattle, he worked a lot of odd jobs before finally purchasing 2 coin-operated laundromats. He and my dad spent a lot of time fixing washing machines and mopping floors. But my grandfather was able to participate in the housing boom that followed World War II, a time when a lot of working and middle-class white people were able to get into an affordable housing market. He could get a loan to buy a house in a good area. That meant that while he was repairing washing machines and mopping laundry floors, he was gaining equity. Fast forward almost 20 years, my parents in the mid-1970s decided they wanted to live in Seattle. My grandfather sold them his side lot at a pretty good rate. He could afford to do that because he owned a now paid-for house. My parents bought that lot and built a house. When my family moved in the 1980s, when I was in grade school, my parents made money on their Seattle house. They invested that money in another house. That history of home owning and equity made it possible for them to do things like take out loans so my brother and I could graduate from college debt-free. My brother and I, not saddled with huge student loans, bought houses, and we both have, you guessed it, equity. Our story is a story of 3 generations of people who benefited from my grandfather being able to buy a house in a good neighborhood in 1955. Now, to be sure, part of that family story is a story of people being responsible, working hard for their money, and practicing some thrift. It's also a story of a family taking care of each other. My parents went in debt to get me through college, and my grandfather bought me my first very much used car. But that story started with my grandfather being able to get a loan to buy a house in an area where Black people couldn't usually get loans. Well, actually, the story started with my family migrating to South Dakota from Denmark and being able to take advantage of another government program called the Homestead Act, but in any case, it started with my family having the opportunity to own land and to gain equity because we were white. My family simply had access to opportunities that most Black people did not have. Hard work was not the defining issue. There were a lot of Black people working very hard as sharecroppers when my great-grandparents started their homestead. We gained equity. The sharecroppers didn't. There were a lot of Black people working very hard in 1955 when my grandfather bought his house. They couldn't buy houses in neighborhoods that were as nice and whose real estate appreciated as well. And it doesn't quite work to say, okay, but anyone can buy in that neighborhood today. When my grandfather bought his house, he bought it in what was a working class neighborhood. But by the time redlining and the like were truly over in Seattle, housing prices had started to climb relative to earnings. By the time my grandfather sold the house in the early 2000s, the neighborhood was not accessible to working class people. Today, my grandfather's old house is worth almost $900,000. And yes, I know he should have kept it in the family. The point, however, is that odd jobs and owning 2 coin-operated laundromats probably aren't going to get you that house today. My grandparents and a lot of white people like them got in on a good housing market when it was possible for working class people to get into the market. By the time the market was no longer as racist, it was a lot more expensive to get in. And that equity made a lot harder to get even as the children and grandchildren of the people who got in early continue to benefit. It's also important here to remember that in this country, equity and education go hand in hand. In this country, property taxes contribute about 45% of the funds that public schools receive. Better housing generates more property tax, which means more school funding. And education, too, tends to be a multi-generational benefit. Now, this is the point at which many white Christians get really frustrated. Some might feel like I'm asking them to feel guilty about their family's past. And I'm not. I don't feel guilty that my grandfather bought a house. I wasn't there at the time and I didn't make the rules. I do, however, think it is important to admit that Much of what I have comes from a system that gave white people opportunities that non-white people didn't have. If I want to help redress wrongs and their consequences, I have to tell the truth about what the wrongs were, who they helped, and who they hurt. The second thing I hear from white Christians is that they're frustrated because their story is not at all my story. Their families don't have equity. Their grandfathers couldn't afford houses in 1955 or 1969 or 1975. They never got help with a car payment. They scraped money together for college if they could afford it at all. And they don't know why people are always talking like all white people got handed $1 million at birth, because they sure weren't. Fair point. Saying that white people had opportunities that non-white people did not is not the same thing as saying that all white people were equally able to take advantage of those opportunities. Being white does not mean your life has been a bowl of cherries. What it probably means, however, is that the things that have made your life difficult haven't been your race. For Black people, things other than race might also have made life difficult, but race is one of the difficulty-making things. For Christians, as people committed to telling the truth no matter how hard, as people who want to think well and wisely about policies and practices, I think this means acknowledging that in the United States, race might not be the only thing that matters when it comes to who has power and equity, who lives next to whom, and how good the neighborhood schools are, but race has definitely mattered and continues to do so. We can't think wisely and well about where we are and what to do if we ignore it. Klan marches and housing maps tell a difficult story about race in the United States during the middle of the 20th century. They show a continuing pattern in which the country was seen by many white people, including white Christians, to be primarily for white people. Sometimes those claims were overt, as with the Klan. Sometimes they were buried in policy manuals and red-lined maps in the back of mortgage offices. But in both cases, their effects continue, both in terms of who we think really matters in this country, and in terms of things like how like we are to live in a racially mixed neighborhood, who has equity, and whose neighborhood schools receive the most funding. They matter for who we interact with on a daily basis, who we regularly see at the grocery store and at the playground and in the seat next to us at church. They matter to me because as a Christian, I care about truth-telling and justice and loving my neighbors, whether they live near me or not. If some people are enjoying the benefits of a discriminatory system and others are suffering the continuing consequences of it, I should want to know that and want to see what can be done about it.